Welcome to episode 3 of the Tonewood Podcast. I'm Matthew.
Hey, and I'm Jake, and today we're talking about Relic guitars.
Oh boy.
Um, oh boy, because everybody else is, so why not us?
Why not us?
Why not us? Matthew is a big believer in Relic guitars. Absolutely loves them.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes, indeed.
definitely, right. He has few contrary thoughts about that topic, so this is going to be a short one today. We'll have time to go play a couple video games or something because we won't be bashing on Relic guitars at all. So that'll be good. But no, I would say, Matthew, you can definitely tell your own story. I'll just briefly start by saying I am not a Relic guitar advocate, but I'm also not opposed to them. I guess I would say that I would have to find the right situation to buy the right guitar. And if I did, I wouldn't let the fact that it was Relic hold me back. If it plays right, if it feels right, generally speaking, I'm a buyer. That's where
I would
that's
agree
where
with
I
that.
kind of land.
Yep.
However, that being said, if you were to consider the Relic finish on a guitar, it's one of those things where I think it's an interesting kind of controversy in the gear community, and kind of the concept of relicking or patinaing or aging exists in a lot of different industries. It's not just the guitar where you have kind of that problem, although I think it is one of the more widespread areas that you'll find kind of that um, really chasing that vintage kind of road worn, so to speak, aesthetic and vibe of guitars that have been played and loved and, used and in some cases misused over the years. So, but in the furniture industry, like patinaing, your furniture, or antiquing your furniture is definitely a thing. I mean, it's a restorer's trick among old, toy collectors,
Oh yeah. Yep.
when you don't get minty ones, if you're just like a hobbyist rather than like a real, like, diehard in the woods collector, you might like a restoration to not look minty fresh and new. If you have something restored, it's a thing in, pretty much anything that has a long-standing vintage desirable component to it, that you want something where it's new and maybe structurally sound but not necessarily like not aged or looked after. But
Right.
with that being said, there's an interesting history to Relic guitars that we'll kind of talk about here in a little bit. But Matthew, how's the Relic argument going for you over there?
It's ruining the guitar community. No.
Oh no. Oh no.
No. Semi-joking. But no, I mean, I have a lot of strong opinions on Relic guitars, which I mean we'll get to in a minute. But I mean, for the most part, I do agree with what you said, that knowing sort of the history of where Relic guitars originated kind of puts that whole market into perspective a little bit. And
Totally.
to your point, that there's obviously analogies or maybe a better word, crossover with other hobbies that do something similar. Furniture, I know is a big, model making. I know
Absolutely.
is another big one, and so it's just it certainly has its place, definitely. And then, like you were saying, what we'll get to, the the history of how Relic guitars started is actually kind of an interesting one.
Very
And to your point, that I can't say that I would completely rule out a Relic guitar, but it would have to be under the right circumstances in order for me to consider them.
sure.
I guess my position on Relic guitars is kind of one of those that falls into that category of, why do you care why people like Relic guitars, and why does it matter? And that's
fair
totally
questions both.
fair enough.
Very
I
valid.
mean,
Very valid.
if you look at any of the guitar subreddits, that is how those conversations always end up. is that
Sure.
somebody has
Any of the guitar forums, you know.
anybody has a comment about Relic guitars, that almost the first comment is just like, why do you care what other people like? It's just like, yeah,
You know,
I mean, that's fair
fair is
enough.
fair. Fair is fair.
I will say though that my perspective on this a little bit sort of, where I disagree with that a little bit is just the way that is the way that Relic guitars to me have often been framed
Sure.
more recently than the way that they used to be. Looking at the history of Relic guitars, that has evolved over the years.
Right. Into something a little bit different from the original vision for it, maybe, if so to
Exactly.
speak, you know, like.
And so I guess where I differ from those that ask, well, why do you care what other people like? And at the end of the day, I really don't. But so many of those conversations with Relic guitars begin kind of from this perspective that Relic guitars offer something that production guitars don't.
Right. Well, and in some cases, Relic guitars are production guitars that have been, you know, artificially aged by either a
Right.
third party company. I mean, you know, there's definitely like, I think that there's degrees of relicking when you start talking like, you know, hand done really tasteful jobs to where you're trying to do it in a production capacity where, you know, if you do have a guitar that you designed to, you know, one isn't coming to mind, but I definitely have seen that before where you have like kind of a little bit of a relic jobber on some kind of guitar that's lower priced and is definitely being done quickly, like, you know, either with, you know, however you would do that, maybe a belt sander or something, and you're not really like looking to capture any sort of aesthetic other than to
Right.
relic it quickly for that, you know, kind of that look and to
Right.
get it out the door. Now, I mean, the flip side of that too is you look at some of the stuff that the Fender Custom Shop, I mean, there's the Murphy Lab, there's a bunch of really high profile relicking going on in the higher end kind of more boutique market, that some of those jobs look, I mean, even if you weren't a Relic fan, I think you could agree that some of the jobs that they do are outstanding. I
Oh
mean,
yeah, I
there's
mean, the Relic process is an interesting one. I mean, just because I mean that takes some major skill to pull off
absolutely,
correctly. You know, to the
yeah,
point where it at face value doesn't look like something that was done recently. I mean,
right.
that is an art in and of itself.
Hmm.
And so I think maybe the better way for me to describe it, I guess, is I guess when I'm talking about production guitars, it's sort of the, I don't know if mentality is the right word, but it might be, or close enough, that somehow Relic guitars offer a experience that can't be had for something significantly cheaper.
Right. With a instrument that doesn't have like a compromised finish, if you will,
Yeah.
or something
Um,
like that.
I mean, I think like all of us have played probably our fair share of Relic guitars over the
Sure,
years.
of course.
And speaking specifically to the Fender Custom Shop, being that they are the originators of
Yeah,
that
they're the first. They're the first company I think that really
first,
started pushing that. You
yeah,
know, like
and made it as popular as it's become.
absolutely. I think so.
That you know, every, I mean, again, I mean, this is such a subjective thing. I mean, I guess there's really no objective way to look at it, just because I mean, you're talking about your preferences and kind of looking at somebody else's perspective on relic guitars was sort of thumbing your nose up at it. And it's just that I know it's easy to come. I know that's probably the way that I'm coming across, but
Mhm.
I guess what I'm trying to do is separate the art of the relic guitar from
Mhm.
its purpose.
Right. Your
And
gatekeeping instrument finishes.
exactly, exactly. It's what I'm here for.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I think with anything, it's one of those things where it is subjective. I mean, like if you're into that vibe, it can be a really cool way to get an instrument that, I mean, especially as somebody who can't afford or, well, isn't really interested in vintage instruments because, A, it's a lot of money. Like I don't really view instruments as an investment, more as like, not necessarily a consumable product that I enjoy, but I try not to buy any guitars that I would be sorry to see the money go.
Yeah.
And vintage guitars are kind of at the price point where regardless of taking a risk on one and having it not work out because I don't like the sound or whatever, I would hate to take a risk on one and also like have something happen to it that would not allow me to, recoup my investment or whatever, because it's, there a lot of them are high dollar guitars.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
you know, there's definitely vintage guitars out there that aren't crazy expensive, but generally speaking, I mean, I think when I talk about vintage guitars, I'm talking about like the really desirable ones, like the Gibsons, the Fenders, the Stratocasters.
Yep.
Specifically for me is what I'm interested in: the Les Pauls, the SGs that are kind of old school and you know have those nitro finishes that have been aged really beautifully over the years, and in some cases they were really used, in some cases they were abused, and all of them have that really cool kind of vibe. But when you consider the finish on a new guitar that's being reliced, it definitely has kind of a vibe. It definitely has that patina. There's ways to make it look really, really convincing, and it does. I mean, like in a lot of the high dollar cases, like like I mentioned, if you go to the Gibson or the Fender custom shop and you look for a really tastefully relic guitar, I mean, I think like with anything, there's a point to where you can have too much of a good thing for sure, but there's definitely a threshold that I would consider pretty tasteful and acceptable. And,
Yeah.
you know, um, like I said, if the guitar was jiving with me in every other way, I don't think I'd let that hold me back. But at the same time, like, I wouldn't buy that guitar trying to like pull one over on anybody. Like, there's kind of an interesting history with that with relicking, because like in the very early days of relicking, before any company was doing it, it was sort of done for a couple of reasons, and kind of at a small scale by either repair guys or people who were looking to kind of maybe less scrupulously allegedly make a guitar that might be misconstrued as one that could be older or more valuable or what have you than it really is,
Yeah,
like
fake vintage.
you don't want to say forgery, because that would be not an unfair position to take, but at the same time, like, that was definitely the intention. So you were doing it for kind of one of two reasons. You were either looking to pass something off as older and more valuable than it was,
Yeah.
or you had a guitar that had a repair in that you needed to alter some characteristic of the guitar in such a way with either a new, bit of material or a new part or whatever. And you didn't want that to, stick out like a new pair of sneakers on the playground when you
Right.
had the rest of your guitar that looked all beat up and vintage and haggard. So, if you had one of those high dollar vintage guitars that you were looking to put, I don't know, maybe a more reliable, hardware component in, or if it needed like a wood repair or something and you sprayed a new finish, you didn't want your new finish, for example, to look new. You wanted it to kind of blend in with the
Right.
rest of the guitar. So,
Right.
you know, back in the day, that kind of antiquing, that relicking, putting a not a phony patina, but kind of blending it in tastefully to look similar to the rest of the guitar was a, you know, relatively accepted practice, amongst people who did have that level of repair done. I mean, a great example of that is on the Stuart McDonald YouTube channel, where Dan Earlywine, who is an absolute gem of a luthier, um, does a really great restoration of this 1953 Telecaster that somebody routed a Bigsby vibrato into. So he's got this whole video where he, routes a wedge out of this guitar, kind of figure matches some, I think it's ash, if memory
Yeah,
serves correctly, or
something like that. Yeah.
it's either, I think it is either ash, or I guess it could be maple or something, or alder, but insets a piece of wood into the top of the guitar and then, kind of sprays it in that butterscotch finish and then, you know, sort of ages it up to look like a 53 Telecaster because,
Yep.
it it needs the, the paint to match the credentials. So that's a pretty classic example of somebody taking an old guitar that needed a major repair and performing the repair to where you couldn't tell the difference and then kind of aging it up so it looks, more or less correct. Now, if, for example, that was done to a production guitar back in the day and you tried to pass it off as vintage, I think that would be, you know, obviously a little bit more unscrupulous. Not that there weren't people who were doing that. Of course that was probably a thing, but
Yeah.
For the most part, I think the honest relicers were the guys out there doing so to hide repairs on old guitar.
Yeah. I mean, that's always been how that originated. Totally makes sense to me.
Sure.
That I mean, again, I mean, you hear that in other areas too, where it's just like you have something that's vintage in and of itself that needs a repair, but like you were saying, you don't want the repair to necessarily a new repair
Stick
is going
out.
to stick out like a sore thumb.
Right. Sure.
So you need to hide it, and so relicking is the solution to that.
Right.
And from with respect to using Fender as an example, I mean that was again, I mean, one of the reasons why that had started out the way that it did, kind of back in the mid '90s.
Mm-hmm.
But that history to me has always been kind of an interesting one. Anyways, just again, like I said before, seeing where it started and seeing where it is today.
Yeah. Sure. And I mean, that being said, I can definitely see the appeal of buying a guitar because, I don't really treat my guitars. I'm not super careful with them. Like, a bunch of my guitars, even, really expensive ones, have some good, honest playwear on them because I don't, I don't buy them to like just collect them onto my wall and not touch them. They all, even if they do have the tagger on them, as Nigel Tufnell said,
Yeah.
they were meant to be played if I'm spending cash on them. So that's fine. And there are people out there who might really hate to put like a ding into a brand new high dollar I don't know custom shop Strat that had a brand new finish on it. So kind of aging that up a little bit from the factory, I can definitely see the appeal of that. If it's got a couple of dings in it already, who cares? If you have an accident, like it's not something that you're going to lose a lot of sleep over because it kind of fits the vibe of the guitar already. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
it doesn't feel like your life has flashed before your eyes if you happen to put it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, everybody knows that feeling. I mean, I
I
can
know what
speak for
that's like.
myself. I had that PRS special 22 semi hollow that I have. I dropped my MacBook on it a couple of years ago,
Oh man, that hurts.
and I know it was my most expensive thing being hit by my second most expensive thing that I owned, and that was not a wonderful feeling. I'll tell you that.
It's like
But
you can see it happening in slow motion.
sure, totally. But, I mean, at the same time, if you're out on the road or whatever, like, that is something that definitely happens. I mean, I've had guitars that, I played out in shows or whatever that really, got their fair share of dings. And some of them were, honestly my fault. And other things are just things that happen. If you have a cord plugged into your guitar or whatever, somebody trips on it, your guitar comes tumbling down, it happens.
Yeah.
It's commonplace, so. I mean, maybe maybe you forget that you had a particularly amorous night at the bar, playing in the I don't know, maybe a open mic night or something, and you have a couple of libations, forget the latches aren't shut on your guitar case. Boy, out it comes when you pick that right up,
there's a lot of easy and there's a lot of easy things that can be easily forgot about.
Yeah, forget strap locks. As the only guy with a beat up guitar with strap locks on it is like, oh, better not drop that. So
yeah, it only takes one time, but
yeah,
yeah. I mean, I guess I think like what we mentioned one time that I mean that is kind of a fun thing to do a little bit is just to type in Google or Reddit search, why do people like Relic guitars or
Sure.
or some other equivalent.
Right. I actually did do that to prepare for this show, and the first autofill result was, I believe I'm quoting directly when I say, the first result out of Google was Relic guitars are stupid.
I wonder if that was because of me typing it over and over and over
Yeah,
again in
I'm
Google.
sure it was you. I was just seeing right after you had Google searched it. I'm sure, like, why are these dumb?
Just looking for somebody else to justify my
Your bias.
my bias. But
But,
no, I mean, again, it's just like hate is a strong word for it, just because that I know that it's there's a little bit more nuance, I think, to Relic guitars than
Mhm.
than I think what maybe a lot of people kind of consider, given reference to the more contemporary Relic guitars versus, again, the old, speaking specifically of Fender,
Mhm.
the models that basically helped form Relic guitars to what they are now.
Launch Relic guitars, yeah.
And I think for me, more than anything else, is just that and again, I mean, this is clearly a personal choice, but it seems like to me, it seems like it is a valid criticism of sorts, even in reference to the marketing of them, is just that as difficult for Relic guitars and how much of an art it is to make a Relic guitar. I mean, clearly the luthiers at Fender Custom Shop, the master builders, I mean, that takes an incredible amount of skill.
Yeah.
And so my opinion of Relic guitars is not in reference to the fact of that there is no skill involved in doing that. I think more than anything else, this just, and I think a person can separate that, is just, to me, is just how not authentic they are.
Yeah, some of them can be. I mean,
I think maybe a better way to describe that is just like kind of like what you were saying earlier. I mean, people want to get into a guitar that's of a vintage nature without spending vintage prices, and so
sure.
Relic guitars is the answer to that problem.
Sure.
But my own biases, I guess, is just I can't get over that rationale of playing a Relic guitar and knowing that none of it was because of me.
Like, the damage is a little phony. Yeah, like, you definitely are the kind of guy to want to put all of the wear on there honestly, like, by yourself. And I mean, I think that's one of the chief arguments against it, right? I mean, if you go online, there's always going to be, people on both sides of the issue. And I think one of the key points for the antagonists is that, if you're putting honest playwear on a guitar, if you give it time and if you play that guitar, a lot of that playwear is going to translate into a pretty good Relic. More so on nitro finished guitars. I mean, they'll patina a little bit more. I guess we'll call it traditionally, for lack of a better word.
Yep.
Rather than the poly finished guitars, but that's not to say you can't get a cool looking poly finish that's kind of worn in. It just kind of wears in much differently, and it's a lot more stable.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's definitely one of those things where I totally see the merit, and I do kind of feel that way myself. Like, if I have guitars that are worn, it'd be a lot more special for me to be able to remember all of the nicks and dings on it. Like my PRS, I'm always going to look at the ding on, thankfully, the back of the guitar. And
yeah, not the front.
know that's where, not the front, but I'm going to know that's where my MacBook hit it. And there's like a very romantic quality to having all of the playwear, with a story behind each nick and ding, and to know where all of them came from. But, I mean, at the same time, I think there's merit to the other argument too, where you have guys who really don't want, or are really nervous, or not that this necessarily describes any specific person or type of person, but there's definitely like people that I've been friends with who buy a new guitar, especially like a high dollar one. In my experience, it occurs earlier on, like right after you start getting into higher price guitars. But
yeah,
it can definitely happen where you pick one of those up and you're like almost afraid to play it because you're like, oh, this is too nice for
It's
me,
too
or like I
nice.
don't want to
Yeah.
scratch it up, or like I it looks so perfect now. It could look perfect forever if I just left it alone
Left it
and
alone. Yep. No,
stayed
I
out
get
of
that.
its way. And I mean, I definitely hear that. But that's not to say like one way is right or wrong. I think it kind of translates to your perspective as a player, like what your subjective opinion is on the aesthetic of it. If you like, I mean, some of the relicing that removes finish on the neck, I've particularly jived with on the guitars that I've played that are relics because you tend to get less sticky,
I actually
you know.
do. The aspect of relic guitars that I do like is just the, I guess, worn in neck. Just a
Mm-hmm.
satin feeling neck. I mean, I've always preferred that kind of
Mm-hmm.
neck in a guitar myself.
Yeah, some of the high gloss ones can get pretty sticky. Especially if if you I've had some stick on me, like especially when I played in that church band that I talked about a couple of episodes ago, like I had a couple of guitars with gloss necks that I tried out. That it was always because you were pausing in between songs. Like at least for me, the way I play, the way that I was kind of the characteristic of just how I play as a player and of my hands, like they weren't getting sweaty enough for for lack of a better way to describe it, to
Right.
make that nick slick enough to not
Yeah.
kind of stick on me. It was kind of like I was playing just enough to kind of like get it feeling good by the end of the song, and then my hand was getting a little sticky on me before I started playing again.
Yeah.
So it was pretty funny. So like definitely like the satin neck guitars, I definitely took the old scotch pad to a couple of guitars that maybe even I shouldn't have done that to. And kind of dulled out the finish a little bit to make it a little more satiny, just because that kind of works a little bit better for me in some cases. But
Yeah. I mean,
um
I do like that. I do like that myself. Yeah.
mhm. And I think that's the other cool thing about relicing is there's the neat thing about it for me is anything that you do to modify a guitar from the factory finish, I suppose you could call relicing. Any mod to the integrity of the finish that like either scuffs out the gloss or adds a little patina in some of the places. I mean, there's honest playware and there's doing that artificially to kind of speed up the process. So
Yeah.
I I think that the some of the really cheesy relics that I've seen are the ones where like almost all the paint's missing, and like it looks like it's been dragged behind a pickup truck for a couple of miles, and
There's a very fine line between a relic that's tastefully done, something that
mm-hmm,
I can kind of be on board with,
mm-hmm.
versus something else like to what you were saying, where uh, you're seeing the grain, the like the
Yeah, on the
grain of
whole
the on the
guitar,
whole
you could
guitar.
you shouldn't have even finished it because there's like 8 speckles on the front and the rest of it's all sanded down. Like that's
Yeah,
pretty funny. But
exactly. It's just like there's good ones and bad ones,
yeah.
for
And I mean,
sure.
that's a vibe. If you're chasing like an artist guitar where that's a reproduction of it, then sure, I mean, I get that. But, if you're talking just an off the shelf guitar, like I think it would be, um, in my subjective opinion, a little too much to go that far with it,
Yeah,
because at that point, why not just buy an unfinished guitar and try that out? Like that could be cool.
yeah,
Who
exactly.
knows?
I mean, I think, I guess what makes sort of the relic guitar market, I guess, kind of interesting is just the fact that you kind of there's this weird blend of
Hmm.
of this vintage aesthetic while having more a more modern foundation to the guitar, which then produces a guitar that is nice to play. I mean,
Yeah,
that's one thing I have to admit, that of all over the years, all of the relic guitars that I've played, they have been nice.
sure.
Um,
They feel great.
I mean,
I mean, they really do. They
they
feel great.
they're comfortable to play.
You know.
Um, and again, speaking of Fender specifically, that I mean they now that they're custom shop guitars, I mean you're getting the benefit of that custom shop attention to detail in the way that they're put together and the way that they're made, and
Mhm.
they're very nice.
I think they're, yeah, I think so too. So that's probably an interesting segue to talk a little bit about the history of why Relic guitars are on shelves these days. Really briefly, I researched the story, and I think it is interesting that there's a couple of different takes on it out there, but from the articles that I've read and what I've been able to piece together, I think the first time Fender looked at relicking a guitar in the custom shop, it was a secret, and I believe it was for Don Was, the producer, because he had produced, I want to say it's Bonnie Raitt's album.
Yep.
She was going to the Grammys in the 90s. I think it was 1990. And they were going to perform together. And he had this new bass. And he talked to J.W. Black at the Fender Custom Shop and was like, "Can you kind of make it not look new?" Because he wanted a sort of a different vibe to it. And J.W. Black was like, "Sure, yeah," like tried to kind of tastefully like age it up a little bit to make it not look new. And so until 1995, my understanding is that was something that they did per artist request. If an artist called into the Fender Custom Shop and wanted a new guitar that looked old for to go on tour with or something, because they didn't want to take like a vintage example for whatever reason, or just wanted a beater they could leave lying around, they would do that at the Fender Custom Shop, like really low key. It wasn't like on any production guitar, it was just on per special request by the artist. And I think it was just before 1995 when Vince Cunetto started working with the Fender Custom Shop, because I think he was making like reproduction, different parts for different old restored guitars that he was working on, and like at least as far as I understand it, was kind of aging up some parts so that they wouldn't look out of place on like old guitars that he was working on or fixing up or what have you, and he was particularly especially good at it. So I think it was for the 1995 NAMM show, they built a couple of guitars and aged them up to look like old relics. I think it was, if memory serves, a Butterscotch Nocaster and a Mary Kay Stratocaster. And they put them in the NAMM booth for Fender Custom Shop. And, it was funny. I remember reading an article, I think it was at guitar.com, where people were commenting on the guitars, and they were like, "Oh, hey, it's really great that you brought a couple of vintage examples, to kind of remind people of where you came from." And they were like, "Actually, these are new. How many do you want?"
Yeah.
They're like, "Oh, whoa,"
like, oh, wait.
So right. So I mean, like, kind of talking about it from that perspective. I mean, even in 1995, like word on the street is like some places, the Relic guitars really caught on. Other places kind of had some trouble moving them, because I think it was a little bit polarizing in and of the time. But if you take it back to that per artist request example, it actually makes a ton of sense. I mean, if you're putting a show on, the guitar in and of itself is kind of a prop that you're using to, kind of have everything look perfect on stage to a extent, if you bear with me.
Right.
But,
yeah.
Like you don't necessarily, if you've got kind of a haggard band or one with a reputation, that like really rocks or cooks, and, maybe you bash guitars up on stage or whatever, like you may not necessarily feel it's as cool to show up with a brand new minty looking guitar, so kind of,
Yeah, it's kind of like keeping up appearances.
yeah, right, roughing it out of the factory. I mean, it totally makes sense to me. Like I can get behind that. And yeah, it's kind of blossomed, or gotten out of control, depending on what side of the aisle you fall on, these days, where it feels like you can't really get a lot out of the Fender Custom Shop that isn't Relic. These days we've got the Murphy Lab over at Gibson, Tom Murphy aging up those Les Pauls really, really tastefully. Memory serves, I think he did the first one of those, like a 59 Relic in 1998 or 9, towards the
Right.
late 90s. But yeah, it's some really, really great looking guitars, and some that are very tastefully aged. And then yeah, there's some, like, I mean, scrolling through the catalog anywhere at Sweetwater or wherever have you, like, I mean, you can cross some guitars that are really, really drool worthy, where you're like, oh man, that looks great. Even if it's not a guitar you'd actually buy, um,
Right.
it's one of those where it's like, oh man, that looks awesome. And then there's a couple that kind of look a little, in my opinion, a little cheesier, where they're either super relict or, like it kind of looks past the point of what's necessarily believable, that, like, I don't know, at least I wouldn't let a guitar go that far. And I realize I'm a little biased in that opinion, but I think it's an interesting history that you know, it came from being something that was done to fit a specific vibe for a purpose that was designed to extend the life of the guitar to what happens these days. And I'm sure you've read the review out there. They exist out in the wild where you get somebody complaining about a ding or a chip in the finish of a guitar that has a relic job. I mean, I remember specifically one where the guy was complaining that his Gibson custom shop guitar had finish flaking off of it. And, I was like, well, yeah, obviously
like,
it does.
obviously it does.
That is the point of the relic job. Like, some of the finish is going to be compromised. You've compromised the integrity of the finish to chase a vibe. That's going to, believe it or not, compromise the integrity of the finish.
Kind of comes with the territory, right?
Right? Like, it wouldn't make sense to spray clear coat over that at the end.
Right.
Kind of seal it all in. Like,
Yeah,
what would the point
exactly.
of that be? So I think that there's a little bit of a, I think it can be a little bit funny. Like, there's two sides that can fall on for me. Either you're, supportive of relics and you understand what you're getting into. Like, it's a guitar that's had the finish aged, and so to age it, you compromise it in some way. You sand it down a little bit, like parts of it flake off. But I think, like, if you do that with the intention to kind of have that be a really good baseline start for all of the playware that you're going to put on that guitar, I get that. Like, you want a guitar that doesn't feel like a brand new Stratocaster feels out of the box, where it can kind of feel a little bit rigid. At least in my experience, I've picked Strats up brand new out of the box, out of the wrapping paper, out of the case, and you play a chord and you're like, ooh, like, it's a little bit rigid, like it hasn't really been played in yet. Maybe you're getting the dust from the manufacturing of the rosewood board, if you have one,
right,
on your fingers, and
yep.
you haven't changed the strings, you haven't put a coat of lemon oil on it, and maybe you want to skip all that and just buy something where it's been kind of relic down a little bit, where some of the finish is worn off. You're not as worried about putting dings on it. Like,
sure.
It totally makes sense to me. If you buy a relic guitar and you immediately go online and say, hey, is this chip in this relic supposed to be there? Like, does that look right to anybody else? I'm going to think that's a little silly.
Yeah, I know that's always been our little conspiracy theory that obviously is exactly that, is that relic guitars were made because of because of people playing
showroom
them in
floor
showroom
syndrome.
Floor
Yeah.
guitars.
Yeah, exactly. To avoid the demo label. Yeah, no, I do think there's probably something to that. I mean, definitely that's making a little bit light of the historical reasons to do it, but I think that's pretty funny. Like,
Yeah,
if you
always cracks me up.
It makes sense from a retail standpoint. Like, I definitely went to a music shop. I was buying my I have a 1965 Fender Bandmaster that I bought new, not too recently. It was not that long ago, but I've definitely had it for a while. And I remember specifically the music shop that I went into to buy that amp had a Murphy Lab Relic. I think it was a 59 reissue that they let me play. Because I went in asking to play like a Collings like the one that I had, to kind of get an exact idea of the tone I was going to be able to get out of it. But it kind of made me nervous to play in the shop because I didn't want to scuff it up or ding it or anything, and
right,
have to buy a high dollar guitar that day, or not that would necessarily happen, but it just made me uncomfortable. So I was like, do you have something that like is less expensive that I could I'm just worried about scratching this one or something. And he handed me the Murphy Lab Les Paul. He's like, well, this isn't cheaper, but they already beat it up, so who cares?
And we can still sell it for full price.
Yeah, right on. That's what I used to be a diehard anti-relic guy, but that was what kind of changed my mind a little bit. I was like, yeah, you know what? There's something to that. I mean,
it's funny.
Yeah, I didn't want to be responsible for breaking a new guitar, so yeah, I get it.
Yeah. Yep.
I get it.
I mean, there's definitely a lot of angles with relic guitars that you can definitely take that taken as a whole. I mean, they do make sense. I mean, it's I guess, I mean, I tend to be pretty opinionated on stuff like that, I guess, but from a practical standpoint, I can understand, why why
see the
people
utility of it.
see the utility of it. And and again, I mean, all the ones that I have played over the years, I mean, they have been nice. I guess I guess that now that then gets into the area of, and again, I mean, that's purely subjective. I mean, there's really no objective way to look at it. But having played the Relic guitars again over the years that I've played, and my mentioning how much, how comfortable they are to play, how nice they've been made, that I'm always, for some reason, brought back to the fact that it's just, it does not feel like I have got my money's worth
Yeah.
out of it. And
Hmm.
again, I mean, that's kind of a silly way to look at it, because again, I know that the guitars are custom shop guitars, again, speaking of Fender. But it's just that knowing how much that they can be,
Yeah.
even on the used market, and looking at what I would have paid, say 35, I mean, $3,500 is pretty, people are buying them at that price all the time.
Sure.
That it just doesn't, boy, I hate to say it, it just doesn't feel like a $3,500 guitar.
You know,
Especially with respect to the the other Fender Strat models that you could get into that
at
at
$3,500.
$3,500.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess to me, it's just, I guess that's kind of what it comes down to, is that, again, I mean, you're looking at it, I guess, as a total package, from the fact that it's a custom shop guitar. So you've got that premium added to it, and then you've got the
Hmm.
Relic added to it, and
Right. Because
the
it's a hands-on
it's
process.
a
You
hands-on
can't do it.
process.
You can't do it artificially. You gotta go spray a good finish. And I mean, I'm not that familiar with the process, so there may be shortcuts you can take. Like, you're probably not. Well, I mean, I don't necessarily know that you're not buffing it out to a crystal shine and then screwing it up. You may be doing that, but
Yeah,
depending on the relic, but you're functionally finishing the guitar, getting your finish to be really high quality, and then you're going the extra mile to then take some of it back off, to increase that patina.
yeah,
So, it's a tough thing to think about the value of it for sure, because it's like, could you get a bunch of different guitars for that 3500? Totally, that are like mint condition. They might be from other builders that aren't Fender, that make um S type, T type guitars,
yeah,
offsets, what have you, whatever your flavor is that you like. And they can have really great things like stainless steel frets. They could have really great things like, different tremolos on them that are, in some cases maybe a little bit more stable, or um, some cases not. You could have different pickups, different, wiring, wacky stuff going on. And it's difficult to look at a $3,500 guitar where a lot of the value is in the treatment of the finish. And ultimately, I think you need to decide whether or not that's worth it for you. And, while I'm hearing your point that it definitely sounds like it's worth it for you, just kidding. You know,
it's 100% worth it.
that's 100% what I'm, So yeah, no, it's definitely true. But I mean, there's the other side of that joke too. I mean, I know that we've talked a lot and joked about it, and it's like, yeah, I currently don't have any Relic guitars that are not done by me. I have tried to Relic a Squire Bullet once, and to your point about it taking a very careful hand and a lot of experience, that's true. Because I'll tell you, if you try to beat up a Squire Bullet to look like a cool Relic, you can't do it on first try.
No, it's not gonna.
Like,
It's not gonna go well. I mean, that's
no,
there
you're
is
gonna just screw it up. So
definitely an art to that.
yeah, to have it look tasteful. But I mean, we've made the joke. I mean, what restaurant would you go to and order a burger and have them, oh yeah, the chef, pre-took a bite out of it for you and ate half your fries, and that's $20 more.
It gives you that authentic experience that you're looking for.
Hey, it's very authentic. Yeah, you're gonna love it.
I mean, I think that's the. I mean, that's the other part of it to me that sort of rubs me the wrong way, uh, with the Relic guitar market, is that there's not. I mean, I know that we said at the beginning of this that there are there are examples of that process in other areas,
Hmm.
but at the same time, that it's also not something that you often hear about either. I mean, sort of a good, I think, analogy is, I mean, I know we're both watch watch guys. I mean,
Aficionados.
hot horology over here.
That's right. Hot horology, fellas. Oh boy. Well, there goes our listener.
It's such a good one, though.
Yeah. I was thinking of the Longines, the field watch, that everybody hated. It came out because it
Yeah.
had the faux dial.
Well, I mean, shoot. I mean, you could even take like jeans. I mean, there was always pre distressed jeans that you could still
Yeah,
buy,
sure.
for the same
You
amount
know,
of money or more. But
yeah.
like
Worn
it,
in leather jackets and
worn
stuff.
in leather
Why not?
jackets. And, the watch one is always a fun one, just because that's something that you never see is somebody is a company, and maybe that's a an area that's just ripe for the picking, is having a watch company that's selling relic watches.
Oh, I'll tell
for
you what. If you go to a watch trade show and you see somebody like Patek Philippe pull out like a a watch that looks like it's really been put through the ringer with like the leather torn on the strap, and they charge you a bunch of extra money for that, it would be so funny to see the reaction that the watch community would have to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's that there's not a lot of equals, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, to relic guitars in other markets.
Right. I think where people are as passionate about them, because
Yeah,
I think it's today a pretty polarizing thing. Like if you're into something like, I don't know, prop building or model building, like you mentioned, like it can be really cool to put like a relic on an old plane or a patina on an old ship or whatever that you're building. In terms of props, like a lot of Adam Savage's viewers will know that he's really experienced and does a very tasteful job of aging up a lot of the props that he makes.
yeah,
Even just for fun, to make them look really kind of appropriate for the the theme of what the prop is trying to do.
right,
Like, I mean, just like it might not necessarily make sense for Pete Townsend to walk out with a brand new Stratocaster, not that it couldn't happen, but or Telecaster or what have you,
right,
and
yeah, yeah,
uh it would just look a little bit silly when when you think about the fact that he's probably got, I don't know, 1,000 guitars back at home that he could pick that are all vintage correct models that, like, he's had for probably years, that
right,
have all been beat up just over the course of being on the road. You know what I mean? So, and in various stages of disrepair. So yeah, I
yeah,
mean, I think that's why it's cool when you find vintage guitars like old Strats Tellys that are, closet case queens, where somebody bought it 50, 75 years ago, stuck it in a case in a closet, you pull it out and it looks almost brand new, but there's still, and I mean, I know Fender Custom Shop has a finish like that, the Closet Classic, where it's got like a little bit of patina on it.
right,
Maybe the finish is mostly almost perfect, but like there's a little bit of like just the lightest suggestion of a little bit of hazing in the finish, and to make it look really like it's been sitting around in almost unplayed condition for a really long time. And
yeah,
um you know just like with anything, if you're trying to go for that vibe, I really don't think that a new guitar would have the same vibe to it, because it's not even about like mechanical integrity, because that's obviously not probably your first concern if you're buying somebody where somebody's taking rocks and keys and sandpaper to the finish. Like you're probably
right,
not being like, oh, now how durable is this finish going to be now, like, because I really want it to stick exactly like I see it here. That
yeah,
probably wouldn't make sense. But um if you're looking for that specific vibe, I think that the Relic, at least for me, that's what kind of changed my mind. I used to be pretty anti Relic, and I am not that way anymore, because I think that when it's tastefully done and matches my subjective preferences, I think it could be a really cool thing to experiment with on a guitar. Have that Strat or Telly or Les Paul or whatever that's already been kind of aged up a little bit for you, where You
Yep.
don't have to worry about putting the first sting in it. You don't have to worry about putting the first chip in it because it's already been done for you. Um, that can be a. I can see how that would take the pressure off of you.
Yeah, definitely.
I
I
guess
mean,
is where I was going with that.
yeah. I mean, yeah. Again, I mean, it definitely serves a purpose. And again, I mean, people that commented online aren't wrong. I mean, it's just like, yeah, I mean, what's the big deal? I mean, if that's something that people like, then
Yeah.
what's the big deal? And it's just like, yeah, I mean, that's true. Um,
Well, and trying to not gatekeep anything about the hobby, like I think that's kind of where I land on most things. Like I'm not going to tell you what I'm happy to tell you what my personal philosophy on it is, but I mean, if you like it, that's great. I'm happy for you, and if you don't like it, that's also great. I can usually see the merit of kind of both sides of that argument, depending on what the argument is. Now,
yeah,
um, you know, that being said, if you're somebody that complains about the integrity of a relic finish after you buy it, like I think that's a little silly.
yeah, there.
I think there's a point to where it gets a little silly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's seeing seeing people comment on stuff like that has always made me laugh a little bit. It's just like, oh, I thought that wasn't that kind of the idea altogether.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
But I mean, the
but
flip side of that too, the utility of if you are like looking to resell a lot of your guitars, for the most part, Relicing kind of takes some of the pressure off of that because you can be like, obviously disclose what you did to it. Like you shouldn't try to pull one over on anybody, you know what I mean? But, I mean, if you have a little bit additional honest playwear on it, or, if there's a couple of belt buckle scratches that go along with the rest of the belt buckle scratches, or, like there's a little bit of tarnishing on the hardware where there was already a little bit of tarnishing and you added to it. Like, I mean, I think that's a fair point for people who want to resell things and not worry about keeping them in minty fresh condition
yeah,
so that they can
exactly.
play and then flip them.
The one thing I could see happening though, and reverb being reverb sometimes is that
Oh boy.
I could see that happening is that somebody's selling a Relic guitar online and then somebody asking is just like, well,
What dings
what dings are Relic and which
are
ones
your dings?
are dings and which ones are the Relic ones?
That's right. Like, it's
Oh, I tell you
pretty
something.
funny. Like,
If that ever happened to me, I'd be out. It's just like, oh, I'm done.
I'm paying for the Tom Murphy dings, but your dings devalue it. I want to know which is which, and I'm gonna assign a number to it, and we're gonna work with that. Yeah, that's silly. Like,
It's
if
like
you like
maybe
the relic of the guitar, lean into that. Have that be the hill you die on. Like the relic of the guitar, but take it for what it is.
yeah, yeah,
Like it wasn't designed to look perfect in the first place. That's how it's convincing.
yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that ultimately, I think that's kind of what I guess the Relic guitars kind of comes down to a little bit is this that obviously myself, I mean, if I was to pinpoint one thing that does, which is why I would never own one personally, is largely just due to I wouldn't be able to get over the fact that the way that the guitar looks again isn't something that was done by me. That
Right.
knowing that you can get a nitro guitar, and if you own that guitar and you play it with some regularity
And you're patient.
and you're patient, that guitar is going to end up that way eventually.
Right.
And that's I think there is something to that that guitar is yours, looking at it from the perspective, it's just like, oh yeah, I mean that guitar has been through a lot. And
Mm-hmm.
um
You
you
have
know
a lot of memories with it.
yeah, I mean, the guy doesn't want to probably get too cork sniffery about it either, but
Maybe
um
sentimental.
yeah, it's just, like you were saying, you don't want to be the gatekeeper of, have that mentality. It's just like thumbing your nose up at everybody that wants a Relic guitar. But I mean, seeing how popular they've become has been the thing that's been a little bit surprising to me, I guess. It's just
Yeah.
how
I would
much
say
that
so.
how much that market has grown.
Mm-hmm.
And the I mean, obviously that's a pretty, like you were saying, probably a pretty, more than anything, that's probably what's common among everybody. Is just that, yeah, a Relic finish is they just like it. And it's just like, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, at the end of the day,
Yeah.
there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a licensed reproduction built by the same company that built the original. Now, I mean, not the same company is a little bit inaccurate. Like it's got the same logo on it.
Yeah,
Uh
it's
maybe is the friendly way to say that. Not that, that's my own opinion. That's not
it's,
based on anything but my
it's
own experiences,
kind of
but
the heritage, I guess, or whatever you.
yeah, like it's licensed, not even licensed, like a relatively speaking authentic reproduction of
Yeah,
a
manufacturer
guitar.
approved.
Yeah, exactly. I
Yeah,
mean, regardless of what company you go with, most of them aren't the exact same company that they were back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, what have you. Like generally speaking, I mean, they're really, really, really high quality instruments
yeah,
with all of the modern philosophies incorporated into the production process, taking the best examples of what we know now and how things have aged over the years, the kind of things that only time and experience can teach you, and incorporating that into new off the line production guitars that you can buy for um I know you mentioned some of the pricing woes, but I mean, if you're into that, I would say that you could definitely make the argument to where it's a fair price. um if the finish and if the vibe and if that kind of patina is desirable for you,
yeah.
I think you could definitely make the case to where that's a fair price. Because like overpriced is definitely, I guess, subjective, just like any other component
Yeah,
of,
I mean,
of
that's
guitar,
pretty
but
relative.
um what you've got to think about is, instead of like fancy wiring or tricky preamps or really, I don't know, stunning wood tops, what you're paying for is the hand treatment of a finish of a guitar that was built with all of the modern techniques and refinements, where appropriate,
Yep.
keeping the legacy and the attention to detail and the vintage components where applicable, and then aged up by hand by somebody who has tons of experience and knows what they're doing, and you get a product at the end of it that has the look and the feel and the vibe to some degree of an original vintage example that you may not want for whatever reason. Like it's you know, be that price or the responsibility of such ownership or the resale value or whatever ticks your whatever ticks your specific box. So
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of, I, I think the important point to be made is just that unless, I mean, I suppose that's an aspect of it too. I mean, it's hard, maybe reading between the lines a little bit too much, but I mean, I think that's kind of an important aspect to consider is that obviously relic guitars are, like you were saying, are trying to mimic something that is, for the most part, just largely inaccessible to the average guitar player.
yeah, I mean,
A 60s Strat is just not something that's going to be largely reachable by the average guitar player. And so it's just,
yeah,
being able to,
certainly not for me. I mean,
yeah,
I'm
maybe
not
me neither. And
dropping tens of thousands on a
yeah,
vintage exam as much as I'd want to. That wouldn't be responsible, Like,
yeah. And so, I mean, I think that's, again, an important point to make, I guess, for anybody that's looking at getting a relic guitar, is that sometimes it feels that the conversation around relic guitars is just like, well, this is going to net you 95% of the equivalent guitar that the guitar is trying to emulate.
mhm.
And personally, it's just like, that's, I mean, largely while that's largely true, I mean, the thing is, the beauty of those older vintage guitars were just the fact of the materials that were used at the time. I mean, you
Sure.
had,
The
you had
history attached to
the
them,
the history
like that.
attached to them, and just I mean, clearly there is something to wood that's been aged over decades, or just different wood types that were used to create the guitar.
Sure.
And so it's just, I think with respect to relic guitars, personally, again, that I think that's something to keep in mind, is that the relic guitar is, I mean, this might be a bad take, but is something that's not going to get you the the same experience that
As a vintage
as a
guitar.
vintage guitar. I mean, I guess maybe
Yeah.
the better way to say that is just it's to me seems just mostly cosmetic
Sure.
with
Yeah.
and I mean not 100%, but I mean it's just like that's seeing some of the conversation behind how relic guitars are sometimes framed. It's just
Sure.
like, I mean, that you're missing some of those things that aren't necessarily tangible in a Strat from the
Right.
60s that there's no way to reproduce that in something that's more modern.
Mm-hmm.
I guess is maybe the better way to put that.
Yeah, definitely. And like with all contentious things in the guitar community, it's something that causes no harm to anybody. Either way you frame it, and there's people who are gonna like it and people who are gonna hate it, and
Yeah, pretty much.
it is what it
I
is. I
mean,
mean, that's why it's interesting, because we wouldn't have this conversation if it was just a universally accepted appropriate thing or inappropriate thing. Like it's cool that all of us can have like such different perspectives on it, and like at least for me, when I sat down and saw some real world examples of like vintage guitars compared to relic guitars, like I mean, trying to pick one up as a not a substitution, but maybe a if you played a modern relic strat and a vintage strat, and I don't know that you wouldn't be able to tell the difference.
yeah,
But the thing about that is there's a lot of practicality to not chasing relic guitars with that perspective. Like I think that argument, like where it's just as good as vintage and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. I don't know that that's not necessarily true. I don't think so personally, but I
yeah,
think you would be able to tell a difference. But that's not to say that, at least for me, between the two of them, if I had to buy one or the other, I'd pick the relic guitar every time, just because it's
same.
easier to, I mean, at the end of the day, that's what you're talking about. Because it's not, it doesn't quite have that responsibility associated with it, and I think that having the conversation of does or doesn't it replace vintage kind of loses a lot of the really cool history behind the purpose for how relicing came about, behind the theories of why relicing could be cool instead of whether or not it actually is.
Yeah, no, I mean the origin story is a good one, just because I mean
you know
I don't that's just something that you don't often hear, I guess, in context of relic guitars these days.
yeah, I don't have anybody that in the comments that I've read for or against it, nobody was like, "Well, these people at Fender Custom Shop back in 1992, had all of these different, different
Right.
philosophies, and this is why." And I think they were idiots, Like, no, of course not. Like, nobody's like citing historic sources, in their comment when they're bashing it,
Yep.
because it's a passionate thing. But then again, I mean, looking at it that way, the guitar is an instrument that it's really fun to play because of the passion you can put into it, because of how it makes you feel when you play it, because of how it sounds when you play it, because of, what it feels like to you to play it. So,
Yeah, I mean at the end of the day that's kind of all that matters. Is just that if it's something that a person has
yeah,
if it's something that a person enjoys playing and they they feel that they get out of it what they put into it, then that's kind of all that matters. So yeah, I think we've kind of covered the bases, I guess, with respect to relic guitars. I mean, at the again at the end of the day, I mean, it's hard not to. You can't really thumb your nose up at anybody per se that likes relic guitars. I mean, it's such a subjective thing that to me, it's unlikely to be something I'm ever going to buy, just because relic guitars as a whole is not something I necessarily agree with per se. But be that as it
find
may,
desirable.
yeah, exactly. That but again, at the end of the day, I mean, I think that's kind of all that matters. Just like, yeah, I mean, if 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 that's what you have fun with, then more power to you.
That's absolutely right. And, coming from the perspective of two guys who definitely are not what I would say are huge fans or connoisseurs of relic guitars, I expected this to be a little bit of a different episode than it ended up being. And I definitely have a greater appreciation for Relic guitars, having kind of talked it through and like, especially done some of the preparatory reading for, for
Yeah.
this episode to not sound like I don't know what I'm talking about.
Right.
Uh,
I mean, it is such a.
um,
I mean, it's not that. I mean, it's an easy thing to do just because I mean, relic guitars is a pretty contentious subject.
it's one of the worst ones,
It's one of
that's
the
for
worst
sure.
ones, and so
I
it's
mean,
easy. It's easy to have hot takes that are
you
just
know,
you own a relic guitar and you should feel bad.
that's right. It's
Kind of
not
thing. It's
Floyd
just like,
Roses or solid state amps. Not that
right.
we both love those too, and not Floyd Roses and tube amps and what have you. But I don't think it's quite that contentious. But it's
Yeah.
definitely like it's something that gets talked about quite a bit, and I think a lot of the framework is pretty polarizing. Like you don't tend to see a lot of the nuanced takes about it. You tend to see pretty black and white ones. But
Yep.
um,
And
I that's not to say they aren't out there, but
yeah, oh, totally. And I'm with you on that one. It's just that it's easy for me to kind of take a knee jerk approach, I guess, to something that it's just like you were saying. I just find just totally undesirable. But when you look at the nuances of how a relic guitars originated, then it's it kind of puts that into context a little bit. It's just like, oh yeah, I mean that I I can I can see the flip side of that coin.
right. And that's also to say that like I think you can not desire to have a relic guitar personally, but like at least for me, you can definitely appreciate the work that goes into making guitars, guitar building, like luthiery, the craftsmanship behind a lot of um guitar making, finishing, like all of the techniques that apply to relic guitars. Like I think that's really interesting. So I definitely think that like, while I don't know that Matthew's leaving here to pop on reverb and buy a relic strat or anything, and I'm probably not going to do the same. I definitely do have an appreciation for what it takes to get a relic finish to look really convincing, for what it takes to get it to look really tasteful. And there is a degree of relic that I do think is really appealing that
Yeah.
I don't know that I would known in the future. Like it like you said, it would kind of have to fall, all the pieces would have to fall into place for me for that to happen. But you never say never.
Yep. You just the right one may come around.
That's right. You don't know. I mean, it's certainly not one of those where if I found the perfect strat and that's what was holding me back, I'd still buy it. You
Yep.
know. So.
Yep.
So yeah, it's a really interesting topic. I definitely didn't expect the conversation to go the way that it did. But I'm really glad we had it.
Yeah.
I
Same
think
here.
it's I think it's a really cool topic to discuss. Even being two guys who aren't like super into relicking per se, I think it's kind of cool to take a step back and examine. Hey, like there is a lot of cool merit to it. There is a cool history to it. There's the I definitely have a respect for the craftsmanship that it requires to get a tasteful looking relic to look really convincing. And I thought it was a overall really cool conversation.
Yeah.
So
Definitely.
that's episode 3 of the Tonewood podcast. Thanks so much for listening. We're grateful to anybody that clicked on our logo and gave us a shot and stuck with us this far. I know we're only 3 episodes in, so you can probably tell because the the editing, the content, the format's probably a little rough around the edges, but we're getting better as we go along. So
We'll get there.
thanks for being patient with us. We'll get there. That's all right. As we said, but we're not podcasters yet. We're learning, so it's good. I'm enjoying it. So thanks for sticking with us for episode 3 of the Tonewood podcast. We will be back weekly. Please give us a listen if you happen to like our content and format. Feel free to rate and review us. If you don't like it, feel free to rate and review us and tell us how big of an idiot we are, and we will definitely agree with you probably.
Most likely.
And most likely, yeah, you're probably right. But thanks so much for giving us a chance, and we hope that you'll tune in again to the Tonewood podcast.